Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam. Part 1. A Prince is Born. The Origins of Bao Dai. On October 22, 1913, in the serene confines of the Don Trang Vien Palace in Hue, then part of the French protectorate of Annam, a child was born who would one day become the last emperor of Vietnam. His birth marked not only a continuation of the prestigious Nguyen dynasty, which had ruled Vietnam since 1802, but also symbolized the fading grandeur of a monarchy slowly becoming a relic under colonial domination. The child was named Nguyễn Phúc Vĩnh Thụy, the only son of Emperor Khải Định and one of his consorts. From birth, Vĩnh Thụy was destined to inherit a throne that was more symbolic than sovereign. By the early 20th century, French colonial authority had already rendered the Vietnamese monarchy subservient. The Nguyen emperors retained their thrones as ceremonial figureheads, presiding over a fragmented Vietnamese realm divided into three parts: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochinchina in the south. Among these, only Annam and Tonkin maintained the guise of protectorates under the French, while Cochinchina had been turned into a full colony. Raised within the imperial citadel of Hue, Vĩnh Thụy's early life was defined by tradition, ceremony, and a deep awareness of his lineage. The palaces and pavilions where he grew up were steeped in Confucian principles and royal decorum. As the imperial heir, he was trained in court rituals, classical Chinese literature, Vietnamese history, and the ethics of rulership. However, even in his youth, it became evident that his path would diverge from that of his ancestors. On April 28, 1922, at the tender age of 9, Vĩnh Thụy was officially designated Crown Prince of the Nguyen dynasty. This early elevation to such a high rank demonstrated not only the emperor's desire to solidify the dynasty's succession, but also the French colonial administration's interest in shaping the future monarch to suit their governance model. Shortly after his appointment, Vĩnh Thụy was sent to France to begin his formal education, an extraordinary decision for an imperial heir, and one that would set the course of his identity and later reign. His departure for France marked the beginning of a transformative chapter in his life. From 1922 to 1925, he resided in Paris under the supervision of the former resident superior of Annam, who was tasked with overseeing the prince's education and personal development. Vĩnh Thụy was enrolled at the prestigious Hatmer School, a private Parisian institution known for educating the children of elites. There he participated in scouting activities, developed fluency in French, and was exposed to European cultural norms that differed vastly from the Confucian court life he had known in Hue. This initial stage of his European schooling was merely the foundation. After the death of his father, Emperor Khải Định, on November 6, 1925, Vĩnh Thụy ascended the throne in name on January 8, 1926. He was just 12 years old. Upon his enthronement, he adopted the reign name Bao Dai, which translates as Keeper of Greatness or Protector of Grandeur. The choice of name signified an aspiration to restore dignity and prominence to a throne that had lost its authority under colonial rule. Despite becoming emperor, Bao Dai did not immediately assume the responsibilities of governance. Because of his youth, a regency was established under the supervision of Tôn Thất Han, a figure favored by the French. The real authority remained firmly in the hands of the colonial administration. During this period, Bao Dai continued his studies in France. From 1926 to 1932, he attended the Lycée Condorcet and later the Lycée Lacanal, institutions known for their academic rigor and for shaping many of France's future leaders. He pursued further education at the École Libre des Sciences Politiques, now Sciences Po, where he studied political science and governance, an education that would be unique among Vietnamese monarchs. During these years, Bao Dai lived in a private residence on Avenue de Lamballe in the upscale 16th arrondissement of Paris. His lifestyle in France was notably Western. He developed an interest in sports, including tennis, skiing, and golf, embracing activities that had no precedent in the austere traditions of the Vietnamese court. This period of immersion in European culture left a deep mark on his character. He became a man caught between two worlds, Vietnamese by birth and duty, yet Westernized in outlook and demeanor. As he matured, Bao Dai found himself increasingly distant from the formal and rigid codes of Confucian monarchy. His exposure to Western liberal ideals, individualism, and democratic institutions would later influence his desire to modernize the Vietnamese monarchy, though always within the constraints imposed by the French colonial regime. By the time he was 19, Bao Dai was prepared to return to Vietnam. His education had equipped him with knowledge of modern governance and international affairs. Yet he also carried with him the conflicting legacy of being both a colonial subject and an imperial ruler. The young monarch returned to a country where his people suffered under colonial rule, where nationalist sentiments were beginning to stir, and where his throne offered more ceremony than power. It was in this tension that his reign as emperor would begin, a reign marked by reformist ambition, cultural conflict, and the gradual disintegration of imperial authority in Vietnam. Part 2. Reform and Resistance. The Return to Vietnam, 1932-1940. In September 1932, after a decade spent immersed in French education and culture, Bao Dai returned to Vietnam as a young man of 19. His return was not entirely voluntary. It was, in part, prompted by the French colonial administration, which sought to reassert the symbolic presence of the Vietnamese monarchy at a time when nationalist unrest was quietly simmering. Still, the newly arrived emperor carried with him ambitions for reform. His mind was shaped by Western political thought, and he hoped to bring modernization and a renewed sense of dignity to the imperial institution, though always within the confines permitted by his colonial overseers. His arrival in Hue was met with formal ceremony, but also with curiosity. Here was an emperor fluent in French, accustomed to European manners, who played tennis and dressed in Western suits. He was not the image of a traditional Vietnamese sovereign, and this divergence would come to define his reign. Just days after his return, on September 10, 1932, Bao Dai addressed a gathering of high-ranking officials, delivering his speech in French, a bold gesture that signaled both his reformist outlook and his intention to reshape imperial authority. One of his earliest acts as ruler was to do away with the traditional lay ritual of full prostration, replacing it with 3 respectful bows. It was a symbolic but significant break from centuries of court etiquette, and it set the tone for the reforms that would follow. These early decisions were not merely gestures of personal preference. They reflected a deeper desire to modernize Vietnam's feudal court and redefine the emperor's role as one who ruled with and for the people. The young sovereign adopted the motto, "Don vi qui," the people above all, a striking departure from the monarchist worldview that had long defined the Nguyen dynasty. On the same day, he issued an imperial ordinance declaring his intention to govern in cooperation with his people under a constitutional framework. Although these words held more idealism than legal weight, since the French authorities retained ultimate control, they nonetheless reflected Bao Dai's aspiration for a more participatory monarchy, even if symbolic. In May 1933, he went further. In another ordinance, he formally announced his assumption of full imperial authority. He called for a rejuvenation of the court and a reorganization of the inner palace, the Noi Cash. In doing so, Bao Dai sought to install a government that was younger, more progressive, and better aligned with his vision for reform. He selected a personal secretary, Nguyen Chi, a Western-educated Vietnamese from Hanoi, who would become his chief confidant and an important figure in the daily operations of the imperial palace. To reinforce his vision, he also eliminated the office of Minister of War, as the military functions of the court had become obsolete under French authority. Another radical idea floated by Bao Dai was to transfer the imperial capital from Hue to Hanoi, a city with more modern infrastructure and greater strategic relevance. While this never came to pass, it reflected his willingness to rethink entrenched symbols of imperial rule. Though the young emperor's reforms had the support of segments of the French colonial apparatus, who saw him as a tool to mitigate nationalist influence, his actions increasingly drew the ire of conservative elements at court. Bao Dai's efforts to enact new penal and civil codes, overhaul education, and reduce the power of the traditional Mandarin class were viewed with suspicion by Confucian scholars and traditionalists. Yet the greatest point of contention came not from politics, but from his choice of spouse. In 1934, Bao Dai announced his intention to marry Marie-Thérèse Nguyen Hu Thi Lan, a young French-educated Catholic woman from a wealthy southern Vietnamese family. She was a symbol of everything the imperial court resisted: foreign-educated, Christian, and monogamous, contrasting sharply with the polygamous traditions that had long been embedded in royal privilege. For many mandarins and members of the populace, this was an affront to Confucian values. The choice of a Catholic spouse especially ignited resistance, as it was seen as a compromise of Vietnam's Buddhist heritage. The Vatican itself complicated matters further. Pope Pius XI initially refused to grant a canonical dispensation for the marriage, demanding that any children of the union be raised in the Catholic faith. The press sought to downplay the papal resistance, but the position was clear. Despite the controversy, the marriage took place quietly on March 20, 1934. Bao Dai pledged monogamy and agreed not to father any children outside the marriage. His bride was given the name Nam Phuong, meaning fragrance of the south, and was titled Empress, unusual for a living emperor's wife, reflecting her unique status. In 1936, their son, Crown Prince Bao Long, was born. He received an official Buddhist education, but also received private Catholic instruction, in line with his mother's faith. On March 7, 1939, Bao Long was formally declared heir to the throne, ensuring dynastic continuity, even as the relevance of the monarchy continued to diminish. That same year, Bao Dai and Nam Phuong traveled to France on a diplomatic tour. The visit reinforced his unique status as a monarch fluent in French, aligned with colonial authorities, and yet rooted in Vietnamese tradition. But even as he made gestures of reform, he remained largely confined to ceremonial functions. The true levers of power remained in French hands. Nevertheless, his vision of a modernized monarchy, one that embraced Western governance models while retaining Vietnamese identity, persisted. It was a vision constrained by the realities of colonial domination, court conservatism, and rising nationalist pressures. Yet Bao Dai, with his idealism and cultivated manners, continued to walk a delicate line between change and continuity, between tradition and modernity, between East and West. It would take the cataclysm of global war to throw that balance into chaos and to thrust the reluctant emperor into a moment of real political consequence. Part 3, Under the Rising Sun, the Japanese occupation and Vietnam's brief independence, 1940-1945. The outbreak of the Second World War had far-reaching consequences, not only in Europe, but across colonial Asia. Vietnam, under the yoke of French rule, was no exception. In September 1940, just months after France fell to Nazi Germany and the Vichy regime assumed control of its colonies, Japanese forces began entering Indochina. They did so with the approval of Vichy France, which, though technically still the colonial authority, was increasingly subordinate to Axis powers. For the Nguyen Emperor Bao Dai, this marked the beginning of an era in which the colonial overlords changed, but the emperor's authority remained marginal. At first, Japanese occupation was carefully choreographed to preserve the appearance of continuity. The Japanese tolerated the presence of French colonial officials, including Admiral Jean Decoux, the Vichy-appointed Governor-General of Indochina. Vietnam remained under French administrative control, while Japan exercised strategic dominance, using the region as a base for operations in Southeast Asia. In this fragile balance, Bao Dai remained a figurehead, sidelined in the face of international power politics. Disillusioned and politically constrained, he gradually withdrew from public affairs, focusing instead on personal pursuits such as hunting, his preferred refuge from the growing instability. But by early 1945, the geopolitical situation had changed dramatically. Japan was losing the war and began reconfiguring its position in Asia to control the narrative of its withdrawal. Seeking to shore up support among colonized populations, the Japanese launched a coup de force across Indochina on March 9, 1945, dissolving the Vichy-aligned French colonial administration in a single coordinated strike. They then turned to Bao Dai, still nominally emperor, to play a central role in legitimizing their new order. Seizing the opportunity to reassert at least symbolic authority, Bao Dai declared the end of the French protectorate. On March 11, 1945, he read an official proclamation of independence on behalf of the Empire of Vietnam. In a carefully worded declaration, he asserted that Vietnam was reclaiming full sovereignty. In view of the world situation, and particularly that of Asia, the government of Vietnam publicly proclaims that as of this day, the Treaty of Protectorate with France is abolished, and the country resumes its rightful independence. This proclamation marked the first time in over 6 decades that a Vietnamese sovereign had spoken publicly of full independence. While this newfound autonomy was orchestrated by the Japanese for their own benefit, it gave Bao Dai a brief chance to act as more than a ceremonial monarch. To lead the new Vietnamese government, he appointed Tran Trong Kim, a respected scholar and nationalist figure, as prime minister. The Kim government set about introducing reforms in education, culture, and administration, though it lacked both time and the material resources to make a lasting impact. The situation remained deeply precarious. The country was ravaged by war, and in the northern provinces, an appalling famine claimed the lives of over 1 million people. The government, still largely dependent on Japanese military support, was unable to respond effectively. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh, a growing nationalist communist coalition led by Ho Chí Minh, was gaining ground among the rural masses, who viewed both the French and Japanese as imperial aggressors. For the first time, the emperor found himself in competition not only with external powers, but with an indigenous revolutionary movement that sought to dismantle the monarchy entirely. Despite his independence proclamation, Bao Dai remained tethered to the Japanese. In a final act of statecraft under their protection, he announced on August 14, 1945, the annexation of Cochinchina, long treated as a separate French colony, into the unified Vietnamese state. For nationalists, this was a symbolic victory. Vietnam, at least on paper, was whole again. But the timing was disastrous. Just a day later, Japan formally announced its intention to surrender to Allied forces following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Without Japanese military backing, the imperial government of Bao Dai was left politically naked. Revolutionary fervor erupted across the country. The Viet Minh, already organized and ideologically motivated, moved quickly. On August 17, they stormed government buildings, tore down imperial flags, and rallied supporters across Vietnam under the banner of national liberation. On August 25, 1945, Bao Dai abdicated the throne. His decision was presented as voluntary, though it was made under significant pressure and amid the collapse of all other authority. In his formal abdication statement, he famously declared, "It is better to be a citizen of an independent nation than the king of an enslaved one." In that moment, the 1,000-year-old tradition of Vietnamese monarchy came to an end. The symbolic trappings of his rule, the imperial seal and the golden sword, were handed over to representatives of the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh's new government, seeking to bolster its legitimacy among the population and foreign observers, invited Bao Dai to remain in a ceremonial role. He was given the title of Supreme Advisor to the nascent Democratic Republic of Vietnam and encouraged to relocate to Hanoi, no longer as an emperor, but as Citizen Vinh Thuy. What followed was a strange interlude in Bao Dai's life. Though no longer a monarch, he continued to serve in a nominal advisory capacity, living in requisitioned government buildings and heavily monitored. Deprived of the wealth and privileges of his former position, he came face to face with poverty for the first time. The court had been dissolved, and the Empire of Annam, along with its stipends and properties, was no more. In the eyes of the new regime, he was both an asset and a liability, useful for propaganda purposes, but a potential threat if he ever sought to reclaim power. In December 1945, French troops began landing in southern Vietnam to reclaim their colonial territory, initiating the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh, preparing for protracted resistance, began to purge potential collaborators and former elites. Though Bao Dai had supported independence, His brief cooperation with the Japanese and his aristocratic background made him suspect in the eyes of the revolutionaries. For a time, he was hidden by Viet Minh agents for his safety. In January 1946, Bao Dai's political life took a surreal turn. He was elected as a Viet Minh representative for the Thanh Hoa province in the new National Assembly. The move was likely symbolic, a way to demonstrate the government's openness and unity. But in truth, his influence was already waning. Ho Chi Minh, who now held the reins of government, was consolidating power, and there was no space for monarchs, even reformed ones, in the revolutionary vision of Vietnam's future. Thus ended Bao Dai's first reign, and with it, the final act of the Nguyen monarchy. Yet it would not be the last time he held political office. His name would resurface unexpectedly in the tumultuous years of war and colonial resurgence that followed. Part 4. Return in the Shadows. The Indochina War and the State of Vietnam, 1946 to 1949. After his abdication in August 1945, Bao Dai entered a strange period of political limbo. No longer emperor, he was now Citizen Vinh Thuy, an independent Vietnam's first former monarch. For a brief time, he remained visible on the political stage as supreme advisor to Ho Chi Minh's nascent Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the new revolutionary order had no place for royalty, even of a symbolic kind. His presence became increasingly ceremonial, his role marginalized, and his personal safety uncertain. By early 1946, the political climate had grown tense. The Viet Minh were consolidating their hold on the north, and the French had returned to reclaim their colonial possessions in the south. Amid this looming confrontation, Ho Chi Minh sought to neutralize potential rivals. In a shrewd move, he dispatched Bao Dai on a diplomatic mission to China under the pretense of fostering friendship. In reality, it was an exile in all but name. While he was away, his influence in Vietnamese political affairs quietly eroded. Once in China, Bao Dai faded from the scene. In April 1946, he left for Hong Kong, settling there as a political exile. His departure marked the end of any association with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. By now, he was entirely severed from both revolutionary and royalist institutions in his homeland. But his name remained potent, particularly for those seeking a moderate or anti-communist alternative to the Viet Minh. The French, now embroiled in a full-scale war against Ho Chi Minh's forces, were desperate to install a Vietnamese government that could rival the appeal of the revolutionary regime. Their hope was to create a non-communist, independent Vietnamese state that would cooperate with France under a French union. But such a government required a figurehead who still held symbolic legitimacy in the eyes of the Vietnamese people. Despite his abdication and exile, Bao Dai, scion of the Nguyen dynasty and one-time emperor, seemed the most viable option. Over the next few years, French envoys began to court Bao Dai in Hong Kong, covering his living expenses and slowly negotiating his return to political life. Though cautious at first, Bao Dai eventually agreed to consider a return. His decision was not without calculation. He despised the Viet Minh's authoritarianism and feared communist ideology, but he was also wary of being used as a puppet by the French. He made clear that any return to power would require real concessions, independence, not subjugation. In September 1947, after months of quiet deliberation, Bao Dai publicly expressed his willingness to resume leadership if it meant resisting communism and restoring Vietnamese autonomy. However, he refused to return immediately. Instead, he embarked on a diplomatic and personal tour through Europe. He visited Great Britain and Switzerland, but most notably resided in Cannes at Chateau Taranque, his private estate on the French Riviera. There, negotiations continued with French authorities over the terms of his political comeback. The key condition for Bao Dai's return was the reunification of Vietnam, particularly the integration of Cochinchina, southern Vietnam, which had long been separated from Annam and Tonkin as a full French colony. Without Cochinchina, any Vietnamese government would lack both legitimacy and territorial integrity. French officials, reluctant to cede control of the resource-rich South, stalled. In the meantime, General Nguyen Van Xuan was appointed to lead a provisional central government in Vietnam, with the understanding that Bao Dai's return would follow once French promises were fulfilled. In March 1949, the French finally recognized the urgency of the situation. The First Indochina War was going poorly, and the Viet Minh were gaining ground. In an attempt to create a credible Vietnamese alternative to Ho Chi Minh, France agreed to the terms Bao Dai had long demanded. On March 8th, the Auriol-Bao Dai agreements were signed. These accords, named after French President Vincent Auriol and Bao Dai, recognized Vietnam as an independent state within the French Union. Though France retained control over defense and foreign policy, the agreements marked a step toward decolonization and the restoration of Vietnamese national identity, at least on paper. Bao Dai returned to Vietnam shortly afterward, not as an emperor, but as chief of state, Quoc Truong, of the newly proclaimed State of Vietnam. This distinction was deliberate. Keen to avoid any appearance of monarchical restoration, Bao Dai assumed a modern republican-style title, distancing himself from the imperial trappings of his past. The new Vietnamese regime would be presented as a transitional authority, an embryo of national sovereignty, awaiting further development. He landed in Gia Lat, a tranquil highland city chosen for its strategic and symbolic neutrality. His family, still residing in France, joined him later. Once installed, Bao Dai set to work overseeing the new regime, which would serve as a French-aligned anti-communist alternative to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The task was immense: to build legitimacy among a skeptical population, counter the revolutionary appeal of the Viet Minh, and navigate a political landscape still dominated by colonial pressures. To reinforce national identity, Bao Dai introduced symbolic reforms. In 1951, he established the Festival of the Mixed Lands, a celebration designed to honor Vietnam's diverse ethnic communities and encourage national unity. He also began diplomatic outreach beyond France, engaging with regional powers like Thailand and Taiwan in an effort to assert Vietnam's autonomy on the world stage. One of his major accomplishments during this period was the creation of a national army. With the support of General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, the French commander in Indochina, Bao Dai successfully negotiated for Vietnam to form its own military, including naval and air forces. This marked a crucial step toward sovereignty, though in practice the military remained under French command and coordination. Nonetheless, it was a powerful symbol of national renewal. Yet for all his efforts, Bao Dai's leadership remained precarious. Many Vietnamese viewed the state of Vietnam as a puppet regime, and the chief of state himself as too closely aligned with colonial interests. Communist propaganda painted him as a traitor, and in 1949 the People's Military Tribunal of the Viet Minh staged a mock trial in absentia, finding him guilty of treason and sentencing him to death. Inside his own administration, Bao Dai faced challenges of a different kind. The French, while promising autonomy, continued to exert heavy influence over political decisions. Vietnamese nationalists who had joined the government hoping for independence grew disillusioned. His authority was often undermined by French advisors, and meaningful reforms were slow to take root. Still, Bao Dai persisted. He believed he could guide Vietnam toward independence gradually, through diplomacy and political compromise rather than violence and revolution. His motto, Dan Vi Qui, the people above all, remained his guiding principle, even as he struggled to make it a reality in the face of war and occupation. As the conflict with the Viet Minh escalated into a brutal full-scale war, the future of Bao Dai's experiment remained uncertain. He had returned not in triumph, but in hope, and amid rising tensions that would soon upend the fragile structure he had helped build. Part 5. Crisis of Legitimacy. The Rise of Ngo Dinh Diem in Bao Dai's Political Fall, 1950-1955. By the early 1950s, the state of Vietnam under Bao Dai stood at a crossroads. Though officially recognized by France as an independent government, it remained shackled by the remnants of colonial control. Its administration was dependent on French military support, its finances were precarious, and its national army lacked true autonomy. Worse still, it failed to win the hearts of a population increasingly caught between the promises of nationalism and the brutal reality of war. For many Vietnamese, Bao Dai's government lacked authenticity. They saw it not as a legitimate alternative to the Viet Minh, but as an instrument of continued French influence. Bao Dai himself bore the brunt of this perception. Though sincerely interested in steering Vietnam toward independence through diplomacy, he was viewed by both revolutionaries and Western backers as a passive and aloof leader. His long absences from Saigon, his lavish lifestyle in Jalat, or the French Riviera, and his unwillingness to confront the colonial administration more directly all fed the narrative that he was more concerned with comfort than governance. He was no longer emperor, yet he did not wield the energetic authority of a republican leader. His title, Chief of State, seemed to underscore this in-between status. Neither monarch nor president, neither ruler nor reformer. Nevertheless, Bao Dai continued to press for gradual reforms. In 1951, he oversaw the institution of national holidays such as the Festival of the Mixed Lands, aimed at fostering unity among Vietnam's various ethnic groups. He also pushed for the expansion of Vietnamese diplomatic contacts beyond France, quietly engaging in relations with countries such as Thailand and Taiwan. His most significant effort was the struggle to build an independent military. With the support of General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, Bao Dai secured French agreement to create a Vietnamese national army that included naval and air forces. But the victory was bittersweet. Command remained firmly in French hands and Vietnamese officers had limited influence. As the First Indochina War intensified, culminating in one of the bloodiest phases of the conflict, the authority of the state of Vietnam steadily declined. In the eyes of both the Vietnamese population and many foreign observers, it lacked vitality, vision, and above all, leadership. Into this vacuum stepped a figure whose actions would irrevocably alter the course of Bao Dai's life. Nguyen Diem. Diem had been a thorn in colonial and monarchical sides for years. A devout Catholic and fervent nationalist, he had previously served briefly under Bao Dai in the 1930s, but had resigned in protest over French interference in Vietnamese governance. For the next 2 decades, he remained in political exile, primarily in the United States, where he built relationships with powerful American Catholic leaders and anti-communist policymakers. As French credibility waned and U.S. interest in Southeast Asia grew, Diem emerged as a palatable alternative, a Vietnamese leader with anti-communist zeal, Western ties, and no association with colonial rule. In June 1954, just weeks after the devastating French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, Bao Dai appointed Nguyen Diem as prime minister, replacing Bu Loc. The decision was made under considerable American pressure, as the United States sought a new strongman to lead South Vietnam. It was a gamble, and perhaps the last major political act of Bao Dai's tenure. Diem, however, was not content to serve. He immediately began consolidating power, establishing control over the military and bureaucracy, and sidelining rivals. He also distanced himself from Bao Dai, publicly criticizing the chief of state for being too complacent and too willing to accommodate French interests. To the Americans, Diem promised strength, order, and independence. To the Vietnamese people, he offered a chance at a clean break from the imperial past and colonial compromise. Meanwhile, the Geneva Accords were signed in July 1954, bringing an end to the First Indochina War. The agreement divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating a temporary demarcation between the communist North and the non-communist South. Elections were promised within 2 years to reunify the country, but few believed they would ever take place. The French began withdrawing their forces, and the Americans increased their presence, rapidly shifting their support from the old colonial structure to the new Diem regime. For Bao Dai, this was a death knell. While technically still chief of state, he had become a figure of the past, politically sidelined, symbolically empty, and increasingly absent. Living mostly in Europe and communicating by telegram, he watched as Diem eroded his authority piece by piece. By mid-1955, the final blow was being prepared. Nguyen Diem, sensing the time was ripe, announced a national referendum to determine the future of the state of Vietnam. The referendum would ask the Vietnamese people whether they wished to retain Bao Dai as chief of state or to abolish the monarchy altogether and establish a republic. The outcome was preordained. In the weeks leading up to the vote, Diem's supporters launched an aggressive propaganda campaign portraying Bao Dai as a decadent, absentee ruler unfit to lead a modern nation. Posters and radio broadcasts attacked his moral character, alleging corruption, debauchery, and betrayal. The referendum took place on October 23, 1955, in an atmosphere of intimidation and censorship. Voters were given color-coded ballots, red to support Diem, green to support Bao Dai, making the vote anything but secret. In many districts, turnout exceeded 100%. When the results were announced, Diem claimed a staggering 98% victory. It was not a democratic triumph, it was a carefully engineered coup. 2 days later, on October 26, Diem declared the foundation of the Republic of Vietnam. Bao Dai was formally removed from power, and the monarchy was abolished. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Vietnam no longer had a royal dynasty. Bao Dai, exiled and disgraced, retreated to France. He would never again hold political office. His attempt to serve as a bridge between tradition and modernity, between France and independence, had failed. The throne he once occupied was now part of history. The country he once tried to lead was now divided, at war, and marching toward an uncertain future under a new, uncompromising regime. And yet in exile, the former emperor would not vanish completely. The last chapter of his life, marked by solitude, loss, and reflection, was still to unfold. Part 6, A Life in Exile. The Decline of a Fallen Monarch, 1955-1972. The fall of Bao Dai in October 1955 marked not just the end of a political career, but the quiet eclipse of a dynastic legacy that had endured for over a century and a half. With the abolition of the Vietnamese monarchy and the declaration of the Republic of Vietnam under Ngo Diem, Bao Dai entered a new and humbling chapter of his life, exile. Once the symbol of national unity and imperial grandeur, he now found himself a private citizen with dwindling resources, reduced influence, and a complex legacy. After being deposed in the manipulated referendum, Bao Dai settled in Cannes, on the southern coast of France. There, in the sun-drenched villas along the Côte d'Azur, he attempted to reconstruct a semblance of royal dignity. Yet the opulence he once enjoyed as emperor and head of state rapidly gave way to financial reality. Without state support or substantial income from Vietnam, he was forced to reduce his household, cut his expenses, and gradually liquidate his assets. The life of leisure he had grown accustomed to during his earlier years in France now became increasingly difficult to maintain. Cannes offered a bittersweet refuge. The city's tranquility allowed Bao Dai to escape the political turmoil of Southeast Asia, but it also served as a daily reminder of his irrelevance. He continued to enjoy traditional hobbies such as hunting and surrounded himself with a small circle of loyal friends. Among them were the Count Louis de Maigret and Jean de Beaumont, an old political figure from French Indochina who shared his passion for sport and nostalgia for a vanished colonial world. His marriage to Empress Nam Phuong, once celebrated as a symbol of East-West harmony, deteriorated in exile. She had retreated to a rural estate in Corrèze, in central France, known as the Domaine du Perche, in the village of Chabrignac. There, separated from her husband, she lived with her children and, according to some accounts, entered into a discreet romantic relationship with André Morin, a physiotherapist she had met in Cannes. Nam Phuong passed away prematurely in 1963 at the age of 49, far from the imperial palaces where she had once reigned. She was buried in Chabrignac, where Bao Dai would later ensure her memory was honored. Their children, including Crown Prince Bao Long and several daughters, were raised in France. While Bao Long retained the title of head of the Nguyen dynasty after his father's fall, his connection to Vietnam remained symbolic. Like their father, the children led lives in quiet European exile, caught between a proud past and an uncertain present. In the late 1950s, Bao Dai found companionship with another woman, Christiane Bloch-Carsenac, whom he met during a stay in Alsace. Their relationship lasted over a decade, from 1957 to around 1970 and resulted in the birth of a son, Patrick Edouard Bloch, in 1958. The child was raised in Alsace and lived away from the public eye. While never officially recognized as a prince, Patrick Edouard would become the last known descendant of Bao Dai and remains the only child born outside the imperial marriage. Despite his political fall, Bao Dai occasionally received invitations from Vietnamese diaspora communities, and he remained a figure of symbolic interest. Monarchists and nostalgic nationalists continued to refer to him as His Majesty, and he was frequently asked for statements or blessings during community events, particularly in France and the United States. However, he rarely made public appearances and preferred to avoid the limelight. His days were increasingly quiet, and the former emperor spent his time traveling between residences in France, rarely engaging in political discourse. In the shifting political landscape of Vietnam, Bao Dai's name retained a certain resonance, even among those who had helped usher him into obscurity. Notably, he never spoke publicly against Ho Chí Minh or Ngo Dinh Diem, the two most prominent men who had replaced him. This silence, whether born of caution, dignity, or weariness, stood in contrast to the often bitter rhetoric that defined post-colonial Vietnamese politics. In 1972, nearly 2 decades after his fall, Bao Dai took a step that surprised many who had followed his life. He remarried. His second wife, Monique Baudot, was a young woman of Lorraine descent, born on April 30, 1946, in the town of Saint-Amand-Montrond in central France. The daughter of a notary clerk, Monique had worked in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and met Bao Dai in the early 1960s. Their relationship gradually deepened, and the marriage, while quiet, marked the beginning of her role as his final companion and spiritual confidant. Monique Baudot adopted the style and title of a royal consort, calling herself Princess Monique. Though lacking formal dynastic recognition, she embraced her new status with enthusiasm and remained by Bao Dai's side until his death. In later years, she would become the custodian of his memory, preserving his legacy among Vietnamese monarchists abroad. By the end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, Bao Dai had become a man adrift in history. The war in Vietnam continued to escalate, now fought between the communist North and the American-backed South. The monarchy he once led had vanished, his homeland was divided in suffering, and his family was scattered across Europe. He no longer held political ambitions. Instead, he turned inward, reflecting on the journey from crown prince to emperor, from ruler to exile. In 1988, perhaps in one of the most personal decisions of his life, Bao Dai was baptized into the Catholic Church. This act, encouraged by his wife Monique, a devout Catholic, marked a profound spiritual transition. He took the baptismal name Jean Robert, a combination of traditional French names that symbolized his acceptance of Western faith and identity. Though he had long been surrounded by Catholics, his wife Nam Phuong, many of his ministers, and even some of his political patrons, his conversion remained a deeply private matter, reflecting the solitude of his final years. As Vietnam approached the end of the Cold War, and its people looked toward a new chapter of reform and reconstruction, Bao Dai remained in quiet exile. His was a life that spanned dynasties, empires, wars, and revolutions. He had once been a symbol of national unity, then a symbol of colonial compromise, and finally a forgotten sovereign whose greatest act may have been his graceful abdication. The last emperor of Vietnam had become a man without a throne, without a nation, and yet not without a story. That story would draw to a close in Paris, where the former emperor, now an old man, would meet his end far from the marble pavilions and incense-filled halls of Hue where his reign had begun. Part 7, Death of an Emperor, Legacy, Funeral, and the Final Years of the Nguyen Dynasty, 1972-1997. As the twilight years of the 20th century approached, Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam, lived a life of fading prominence in France. From his quiet residence in Paris and occasional visits to the countryside, he watched the world he once influenced continue without him. No longer bound by official duties or the weight of dynastic expectations, He existed in solitude, shadowed by history and increasingly distanced from the turbulent homeland he once ruled. By the 1970s, the Vietnam War had reached its peak, with American involvement escalating, then unraveling. Through it all, Bao Dai remained on the periphery. He refrained from public comment, even as the nation split by the Geneva Accords in 1954 crumbled further into devastation. North and South Vietnam were at war, Saigon fell in 1975, and the Unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam was established under communist leadership. Still, the former emperor offered no condemnation, no memoirs, and no political statements. He maintained an unwavering silence about those who had succeeded him, including both Ho Chi Minh, who led the Viet Minh Revolution that ended his reign, and Ngo Dinh Diem, the prime minister who ousted him in 1955. In this silence lay something deeper than detachment, perhaps an acceptance that he had been a transitional figure in an age of upheaval. His reigns, both as emperor and as chief of state, had been marked by compromise and contradiction. He had stood at the crossroads of empire and independence, of monarchy and modernity, of East and West. In many ways, Bao Dai was not a leader of action, but a symbol, a man through whom history moved, often against his will. His relationship with Monique Baudot, whom he married in 1972, became the emotional cornerstone of his final decades. Monique, nearly 33 years his junior, devoted herself entirely to preserving what remained of imperial dignity. Though the world no longer recognized Vietnamese royalty, she insisted on the titles and decorum associated with her position. Styling herself as Princess Monique, she eventually adopted the name Empress Thai Phuong after Bao Dai's death. She organized yearly memorial masses in his honor and became the unofficial guardian of the Nguyen dynasty's symbolic heritage. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Bao Dai lived quietly, but not in complete isolation. Occasionally, he received visitors from the Vietnamese diaspora, monarchists, old political allies, or descendants of former mandarins. These meetings were seldom publicized, but they reinforced the lingering reverence some communities still felt for the fallen sovereign. To others, however, he remained a symbol of wasted opportunity and royal passivity in the face of colonial injustice and national struggle. His health began to deteriorate in the early 1990s. Suffering from a range of ailments, he withdrew even further from public life. The once vigorous tennis player and hunter, the cosmopolitan emperor fluent in French and versed in European diplomacy, had grown frail and introspective. He was no longer seen in Cannes or Alsace, nor did he attend any official ceremonies. Paris became his final home and eventually his final resting place. On July 31, 1997, Bao Dai died at the Val-de-Grâce Military Hospital in Paris. He was 83 years old. The cause of death was a brain tumor, and his passing was quiet, devoid of fanfare. Yet his death marked the end of an epoch, the final breath of Vietnam's imperial history. Despite decades of animosity between the Nguyen monarchy and the Vietnamese Communist Party, the government in Hanoi acknowledged his passing in a gesture of symbolic reconciliation. The state sent a floral wreath to his funeral, an act that surprised and touched many within the overseas Vietnamese community. It was perhaps an implicit recognition of Bao Dai's unique place in national history, not as a ruler of power, but as the last heir to a vanished world. His funeral was held with modest dignity in Paris. Attended by family, close friends, and members of the diaspora, the ceremony offered a quiet tribute to a life of contradictions. Bao Dai was buried in the Passy Cemetery, 3rd Division, a peaceful resting place not far from the Seine and the Eiffel Tower, a world away from the citadel of Hue, where emperors once ruled under the gaze of ancestral spirits in dragon-carved thrones. In the years that followed, his widow Monique, now self-styled as Empress Thai Phuong, maintained an annual mass in his memory at the Saint-Louis des Invalides Cathedral in Paris. Dressed in elegant mourning attire, she would light candles and offer prayers not only for Bao Dai, but for the restoration of harmony among the Vietnamese people. Though her position was entirely symbolic, She maintained an aura of nobility and became a familiar figure among monarchist and nostalgic circles within the diaspora. She passed away in September 2021 at the age of 75. With her death, the final courtly echoes of the Nguyen dynasty in Europe fell silent. Though Bao Dai left behind no official autobiography, no sweeping political treatises, and few public declarations, his life told a profound story. He was a man at the mercy of immense historical forces, a monarch without power, a reformer without a nation, and an exile without a kingdom. Yet through it all, he bore his fate with an unshakable calm, never bitter, never vengeful, never boastful. He lived through colonial rule, global war, national revolution, and the Cold War. He was educated in France, crowned in Vietnam, dethroned by communists, resurrected by colonialists, and finally deposed by Republicans. He fathered children in both East and West and spent his final decades walking the boulevards of Paris, far from the incense smoke and temple drums of his ancestors. He was the last emperor of Vietnam, not because he chose to be, but because history had no more room for emperors. And in his passing, the last flicker of imperial grandeur dissolved into the stream of a new, turbulent, and contested Vietnamese identity. Part 8, Legacy and Reflection. The Princes, the Dynasty, and the Memory of Bao Dai. The death of Bao Dai in 1997 brought to an end not only the life of Vietnam's last emperor, but also a profound historical chapter. His departure sealed the fate of the Nguyen dynasty, whose line had reigned for over a century and a half, from the unification of Vietnam under Emperor Gia Long in 1802 to Bao Dai's abdication in 1945. And yet, even in death, Bao Dai's legacy lingered, complex, controversial, and continually reinterpreted. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, attention turned to the question of dynastic succession. Although the monarchy had long since ceased to exist as a political institution, its ceremonial continuity remained deeply important to monarchists, Vietnamese royalists in the diaspora, and scholars of Vietnamese history. By dynastic right, the headship of the House of Nguyen passed to Bao Dai's eldest son, Crown Prince Bao Long. Born in 1936 in the imperial city of Hue to Bao Dai and Empress Nam Phuong, Bao Long had been groomed during his early years to carry on the Nguyen legacy. His education was similar to that of his father, French, Catholic, and cosmopolitan. After his family's exile, he remained in France and later served as a lieutenant in the French Foreign Legion, notably in Algeria. Reserved and discreet, he avoided political life and rarely gave interviews. Nevertheless, monarchists formally recognized him as the symbolic head of the Nguyen dynasty upon his father's death. Bao Long's role was primarily representative. He occasionally attended memorial ceremonies and events organized by Vietnamese monarchist groups, but he never laid claim to political authority. His life, like his father's, was lived in quiet exile. In 2007, he died in Paris at the age of 71, and with his death, yet another direct link to Vietnam's imperial past was severed. Succession then passed to his younger half-brother, Prince Bao Thang, a more reclusive figure who inherited the dynastic title, but showed little interest in public life. He too passed away in 2017. These silent transitions underscored the reality that the Nguyen dynasty had become less an institution and more a lineage, a family story woven into the broader fabric of a Vietnamese history. Among the Vietnamese diaspora, particularly in France and the United States, Bao Dai's memory endured in varying tones. Some regarded him with nostalgia, a tragic monarch overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. Others criticized him as indecisive, overly indulgent, and too accommodating to foreign powers. To his detractors, he was a man of missed opportunities, a sovereign who failed to lead, a patriot who never fought. Still, his defenders pointed to his consistent desire for peaceful reform, his personal courage in abdicating for the sake of national unity, and his refusal to use his status for revenge or political agitation in exile. Notably, Bao Dai's personal restraint was striking. Throughout the Cold War, as many exiled leaders from other nations issued fiery condemnations of their former adversaries, Bao Dai remained silent. He never published a memoir or attempted to rehabilitate his reputation through political writings. He did not speak against Ho Chi Minh or Ngo Diem, despite having reason to resent both. Instead, he allowed history to pass judgment. His former wife, Empress Nam Phuong, once the most prominent female figure in the Vietnamese court, also left behind a legacy of quiet dignity. She was remembered fondly in both France and among the older Vietnamese community for her charity, grace, and deep religious conviction. Her death in 1963, while separated from Bao Dai, became a symbolic moment for many monarchists, a silent closing of the chapter on Vietnam's golden era of royal pomp and pageantry. Monique Baudot, Bao Dai's second wife, later known as Empress Tai Phuong, did much to preserve the legacy of her husband. Each year, she organized solemn memorial masses at the Saint-Louis des Invalides Cathedral in Paris, attended by a small circle of loyalists, Vietnamese Catholic clergy, and nostalgic exiles. These ceremonies became opportunities to reflect not only on Bao Dai's life, but also on the broader arc of Vietnamese history, a reminder of how rapidly a nation can change and how quietly dynasties can fade. For the Vietnamese Communist government, Bao Dai's memory remained complicated. While once labeled a collaborator and traitor, his abdication and symbolic role in the transfer of sovereignty to the Viet Minh were increasingly viewed in a less hostile light. The gesture of sending a floral wreath to his funeral in 1997, modest though it was, signaled a subtle shift in the official narrative. Even in a country where the monarchy had been abolished and revolutionary legitimacy reigned supreme, the historical weight of Vietnam's imperial past could not be entirely erased. Bao Dai's legacy also persisted in physical form. In the ancient imperial capital of Hue, many palaces, tombs, and temples associated with the Nguyen dynasty have been preserved, restored, and opened to the public. Tourists walk the same corridors where Bao Dai once held court, gaze upon portraits of emperors, and stand before the golden thrones that symbolize the last dynasty of Vietnam. Among these preserved relics, the memory of the final sovereign lingers, particularly in the last imperial residence, the An Dinh Palace, where the style of French colonial architecture blends with traditional Vietnamese motifs, just as it did in Bao Dai's own hybrid identity. In Vietnamese history textbooks, his name is often treated briefly, almost as a transitional figure between colonialism and revolution. Yet his life story spans a vast arc, from the last years of the Qing dynasty in French Indochina to the Atomic Age, from imperial palaces in Hue to exile in Paris, from emperor to private citizen. No Vietnamese ruler before or after him witnessed such dramatic transformations. His story is not one of grandeur and glory, but of adaptation and quiet resignation. His reign may not have left monumental achievements or sweeping reforms, but it left behind a unique portrait of a man who bore the burden of a fading world with a quiet grace that neither time nor revolution could erase. Part 9. The Historical Verdict. Bao Dai's place in Vietnam's national narrative. The final assessment of Bao Dai's legacy poses a complex and often polarizing question in the historiography of Vietnam. Was he a reluctant monarch caught in the cross-currents of empires and revolutions? A symbol of decline and decadence? A bridge between old and new Vietnam? Or perhaps all of these simultaneously? To judge him is to confront the paradoxes of Vietnamese modern history, of colonialism, nationalism, and identity. Historically, Bao Dai has long been overshadowed by more forceful figures: Ho Chi Minh, who led the revolution, Ngo Diem, who forged the republic, and even French colonial administrators who shaped policy with far more influence than any Vietnamese court official could wield. Yet Bao Dai was the thread connecting all of them, a symbol and a survivor, the one man who lived through and bore witness to every transformation of 20th century Vietnam. In the official communist historiography of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Bao Dai was for decades portrayed as a weak and ineffectual monarch who collaborated first with the French, then the Japanese, and finally again with the French, a figure used and discarded by colonial powers. This version of the narrative emphasized his passive nature, his personal indulgences, and his inability to mobilize a nation in the way that revolutionary leaders did. He was, in this view, a relic of a feudal past that Vietnam needed to cast aside in order to become a modern, unified nation. Yet over time, this portrayal has softened. The fact that Bao Dai peacefully abdicated in 1945 and handed the imperial regalia to the Viet Minh, rather than attempting to cling to power or flee abroad, is increasingly recognized as a dignified and even patriotic gesture. His abdication allowed the revolutionary government to claim symbolic legitimacy, helping smooth the transition of power and contributing, albeit indirectly, to the founding of an independent Vietnam. It was, as some scholars now argue, a choice made not out of cowardice, but conviction. Better to be a citizen of an independent country than the king of a subjugated one, he famously said, words that still resonate with a certain nobility. In South Vietnam, Bao Dai's role as chief of state in the early years of the state of Vietnam has been the subject of similarly mixed interpretations. While some saw him as a puppet of French interests and an absentee ruler, others viewed his moderate and constitutionalist approach as a missed opportunity for peaceful reform. His decision to appoint Ngo Dinh Diem, who would ultimately depose him, was a fatal political miscalculation. Yet it also reflected his willingness to experiment with alternatives to monarchy. In this, Bao Dai displayed a flexibility rare among royals of his era. Among the Vietnamese diaspora, particularly those who fled after the fall of Saigon in 1975, Bao Dai's image varies widely. Monarchist groups revere him as the last legitimate sovereign of Vietnam. Others, particularly Republicans and anti-communists, criticize him for his passivity and perceive lack of commitment to resisting either French colonialism or communist totalitarianism. Yet even among his critics, there is often a measure of sympathy for the impossible position he was placed in and for the understated way in which he bore the loss of a kingdom, a country, and eventually a role in history. Western historians have likewise grappled with Bao Dai's legacy. Many describe him as a tragic figure, neither villain nor hero, but a man caught between two collapsing worlds. They note that while he was Western-educated, reform-minded, and genuinely invested in Vietnam's future, he lacked the charisma and resolve of a revolutionary leader. His greatest virtue may have been his willingness to yield, to avoid bloodshed, to accept defeat with quiet dignity. In this sense, he is often compared not to imperial conquerors, but to other dethroned monarchs who exited the stage without bitterness. Figures like Italy's Umberto II or Bulgaria's Simeon II. His character, too, remains difficult to fully grasp. On the one hand, he was fluent in diplomacy, charming in conversation, impeccably dressed, and worldly in his tastes. He practiced tennis and golf, enjoyed French cuisine, and surrounded himself with cosmopolitan companions. On the other hand, he was often aloof, disengaged from the everyday struggles of his people, and politically hesitant at crucial moments. To some, these were signs of weakness. To others, they reflected a man out of place in the age of mass movements, ideology, and revolutionary warfare. The places associated with Bao Dai today carry a different kind of legacy. In Hue, the tombs and palaces of the Nguyen emperors have been preserved as historical monuments, and his summer retreat in Jalat, the Bao Dai Palace, is now a tourist site, filled with photos and relics from his reign. His name is remembered in street signs, books, and documentaries, not as a celebration of monarchy, but as a nod to Vietnam's complex journey through modernity. In the end, Bao Dai was not a king of conquest or glory. He was a sovereign of twilight and transition, whose life marked the gentle fading of a thousand-year-old tradition. His reigns were defined not by decisive acts, but by moments of restraint, by his decision to abdicate, to remain silent in exile, and to never condemn even those who supplanted him. In doing so, he allowed Vietnam to step into a new and turbulent age, without war over the throne, without a monarch demanding restoration. The final verdict on Bao Dai may never be unanimous. He was a man of contradictions, whose life invites reflection rather than judgment. Yet one thing is certain. As the last emperor of Vietnam, he occupies a place no one else can. He was the bridge between dynastic Vietnam and the modern republic, between the imperial past and the revolutionary present. And for all his silences and shadows, that place in history will always remain his.